One by one, territories joined together, creating a patchwork nation of 50 different states, united, but each with its own history, spirit, culture, and landmarks. Let's explore the history of 5 of them. New York, Oregon, Louisiana, New Mexico, and Vermont. Welcome to the States. This state was the site of America's first public brewery, the location of its oldest cattle ranch, and the home of the man who wrote The Wizard of Oz. Think it's Kansas? Think again. Greetings from New York. Of the original 13 colonies, it was the 11th to ratify the U.S. Constitution, and it did so on July 26, 1788. With 19.3 million residents, it ranks 3rd in population. Even though the state legislature meets in Albany, it's impossible to begin any discussion about New York, the state, without starting here, New York, the city. A city so grand, it's actually made up of 5 counties called boroughs.
Well, New York is really a series of islands, and the only part of New York City that's on the mainland of the United States is what's now known as the Bronx. So it's really 5 counties. In America, mostly cities are within counties. But in New York City, it's the reverse. There are 5 counties that are within the city.
New York has 8.5 million, 9 million people, and it proves conclusively that nature's finest sight is a crowded street.
Everybody's in a mission to do their thing. They don't want to be sidetracked, right? I mean, you can see 1 million people a day, but only speak to 2.
Living in these crowds is a pleasant experience. New Yorkers are, without a doubt, the most mannerly people I've ever seen, anybody's ever seen.
In New York, you are both alone, but yet very surrounded. In New York, you can be anything you want, at any time you want. You are a New Yorker.
And you've got one other thing, the chance to make it, to do something. You come here for yourself, you come here to make it. And there's a shot, someplace in this city, there's a shot.
Upstate New York and Manhattan form a symbiotic relationship. And that's created by the harbor in Manhattan and the surrounding waterways in upstate New York.
The Hudson River is not only the principal river in the state, it is one of the most important commercial waterways in America. The Hudson stretches over 300 miles, from New York Harbor nearly to the Canadian border. For a time, it runs alongside the breathtaking Adirondack State Park, a state park that is actually larger than any national park outside of Alaska. To the west, you'll find the oldest state park in the nation at Niagara Falls. It forms part of a 445-mile border with Canada. New York is also the #2 apple-growing state in America and is the largest producer of wine on the East Coast. But in the larger world of commerce and culture, the city of New York is second to none.
It is the center of American business, the center of American fashion. In some ways, the center of advertising, the center of the theater, the center of art, the center of music, the center of dance, certainly in an American sense and arguably in a world sense.
What makes New York feel like home is its vibrancy, its heterogeneity. There are so many different kinds of people here.
New York has everyone. I mean, from Estonians to Ukrainians to Jamaicans to Irish. There is no group that's not in New York City. And the #7 subway's been called the International Express because every stop is a different country.
Me gusta Nueva York porque aquí está todo.
New York City is but the gateway to the Empire State. The journey inland became much easier in 1807, when Robert Fulton's steamship, the Clermont, made its maiden voyage from New York City to Albany. Just down the road from the state capitol during the War of 1812, one Sam Wilson provided large shipments of meat to the U.S. Army. Wilson's meat barrels were stamped with the initials U.S., Supposedly, someone who saw the stamp suggested, perhaps as a joke, that the initials stood for Uncle Sam. One thing led to another, and ultimately, Uncle Sam came to symbolize the federal government. This was not the first time New York played a significant role in American political life.
The first capital of the United States was New York City, after the British Army evacuated the city after holding it for most of the course of the American Revolution. George Washington was sworn in as president at the lower tip of Manhattan.
Before there was a New York State or a New York City, there was New Amsterdam, set up by the Dutch as a merchant colony. Its most famous early governor was a peg-legged Dutch businessman named Peter Stuyvesant.
The Dutch founded New York to make money. People would say New York is still about making money. It's not about gracious living, it's not about easy living. And that trend was set 400 years ago by the Dutch, who established a trading post at the foot of Manhattan Island and called it New Amsterdam.
New Amsterdam became New York when the English came in 1664 with a modest invasion fleet that was enough to overcome the thought of Dutch resistance. The local Dutch citizens did not want to fight, and Peter Stuyvesant, with great reluctance, surrendered the colony.
And so they kind of march out with bands playing and flags flying, but march out they do, and it changes to British ownership, and the name is changed from New Amsterdam to New York.
Once New York City was established, the colonists turned their gaze to the west.
The Erie Canal was incredibly significant in westward expansion, not just in New York, but in the Ohio country and the Great Lakes and beyond.
The building of the Erie Canal created the equivalent of an aquatic superhighway. Waterborne cargo could enter New York Harbor, go up the Hudson River, and then, via the canal, cut across the entire state and into Lake Erie.
It was the principal conduit for the movement of people and goods and raw materials east-west and west and east. It had enormous significance in the building up of cities along its route.
Cities like Rochester, Syracuse, and Buffalo became important industrial towns as a result of the canal, which was constructed at a cost to the state of over $7 million. This investment was quickly recouped by collecting tolls from vessels using the canal. The original Erie Canal remained in active use for 80 years and brought economic boom times to upstate New York, which had plenty of room to spread out. For New York City, however, there was nowhere to go but up.
The streets were laid out east and west, and the avenues were laid out north and south. The gridiron prohibited building horizontally. You couldn't cross the streets or the avenues, and so you had to go vertically. It was kind of like a pressure cooker. And so I would suggest that the beginning of the skyline of New York dates from that gridiron plan.
Beginning in the Roaring '20s, New York witnessed a skyscraper competition. 40 Wall Street reached up to 70 stories. The Chrysler Building came in at 77 stories. The Empire State Building, built in 1931, won the contest at 102 stories and over 1,000 feet high. In 1966, construction began on two new skyscrapers called the World Trade Center, which would reshape and invigorate Lower Manhattan.
By 1990, 25 of the 100 tallest buildings on the planet were in New York City. There is no concentration like that anyplace else on Earth. There's a historian who said that the skyline of New York is the most unbelievable man-made spectacle since the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Probably so.
Then came September 11th, 2001. The skyline and the psyche of New York City were changed forever.
I think by nature, New Yorkers are very tough, resilient people, and I think that they won't be deterred by terrorists or anything to continue our way of life.
The destruction of the World Trade Center was a terrible blow psychologically and financially for New York City, for New York State, for this country. But we're recovering from it. We will recover from it. We're New Yorkers.
After Pearl Harbor and all during World War II, every state in the Union was on high alert for another attack on the homeland. While LA and San Francisco seemed the most likely targets, the only place in the lower 48 to actually be bombed by a Japanese aircraft was this state. Greetings from Oregon, the 33rd state, admitted to the Union on Valentine's Day, 1859. With 3.7 million residents, it ranks 27th in population.
People who live in Oregon are called Oregonians. Oregon, by the way, I have to say, is not pronounced Oregon. It didn't go anywhere. There is not an E on the end of it. It's Oregon.
A former governor of Oregon, Tom McCall, once said, "Come visit us again and again, but for heaven's sake, don't come here to live." PR faux pas? Maybe. But it's also the kind of straight talk and progressive thinking that has made Oregon distinctive for many years.
This is a place that people feel that they can control their destiny if they work at it, and that volunteerism and public engagement in politics and political activism and social activism is the norm here rather than the exception.
There are very, very, very staunch conservative Republicans in Oregon, and they're the most extremely left liberals you can imagine are in Oregon, and they all coexist in this great state full of ideas and debate as a result.
Yeah, I think most Oregonians are independent. They're very free thinkers, and they're not afraid to say what they think and tell you where they're at.
Oregon is so progressive because otherwise no one would know who we were. They would have no idea where Oregon is. They think California goes right into Washington.
Oregon certainly put itself on the map in 1997 when it became the first state to legalize physician-assisted suicide, a decision no other state has made.
There's, I think, a deep distrust of any state or government telling Oregonians what they can do on a level of personal liberty.
On the other hand, Oregonians do have a law telling people they can't pump their own gas, but it's for a good reason.
If we start pumping our own gas, we're putting a lot of people out of work.
The irony here is that many Oregonians will almost always choose their bikes over their cars.
There's some mornings, some people joke about how the Hawthorne Bridge sometimes seems like the scene out of Vietnam. There's so many people on bikes going in and out from work every day.
Oregonians do enjoy the great outdoors, from the tall, dense forests in the western part of the state to the less familiar terrain of prairies and deserts that cover approximately half the state on the eastern side. 5 of our nation's 53 active volcanoes sit within Oregon's boundaries. Crater Lake, the deepest lake in the country and the 7th deepest in the world, was formed in the remains of an ancient volcano more than 7,700 years ago.
It's one of the first places where tourists drove out into the quote-unquote wilderness to see a spectacle like Crater Lake.
Oregon's wild salmon industry is one of the largest in the world.
I fillet all the way from 500 to maybe 9 to 1,000 pounds a day.
The state's rivers are rich in history as well. In 1805, these waterways brought Lewis and Clark to coastal Oregon. They landed in what is now Astoria, a town of about 10,000 at the mouth of the Columbia River. It is the oldest American settlement west of the Rockies. 40 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition, thousands of settlers began making the journey west on the treacherous Oregon Trail, so named as it ended in the Oregon Territory. A common misperception about the Great Migration is that hostile Native Americans were the #1 problem for the pioneers.
What we know from statistics, and historians have gone back and looked at this very closely, that most deaths along the Oregon Trail were caused by either drownings or accidental shootings.
I mean, just think about it. Oregon is made up of people who followed the Oregon Trail to the very end. who didn't stop somewhere along the way, but kept going. These are very fierce people.
100 years later, Oregon was the only mainland state that was attacked during World War II by a piloted Japanese aircraft. On September 9th, 1942, Nobuo Fujita, a pilot in the Japanese Imperial Navy, was on an I-25 Japanese submarine off the coast of Oregon. The sub surfaced and Fujita climbed into a seaplane that was mounted on the deck of the sub and armed with small incendiary bombs.
The idea was that they would drop these on the forests of Oregon, and they would ignite the forests of Oregon and maybe the entire Pacific Northwest and would destroy this valuable resource.
Fujita flew southeast over the Oregon coast and dropped his bombs on Mount Emily, 10 miles northeast of the town of Brookings.
Didn't succeed in igniting the forest, but it certainly had a psychological impact on Oregonians and nationwide. Is this just the tip of the iceberg? Is this the beginning of a mainland invasion by the entire Navy? Very uncertain what this is representing.
Fujita himself survived the war to become a successful businessman in Japan.
And so in 1962, Fujita came back to Oregon and visited the site of where he had flown his plane. And it was this interesting gesture of peace between the United States and Japan, and for the most part, local Oregonians embraced Fujita.
The town of Brookings played another significant role in Oregon's history. It was one of several major lumber-producing towns in a state that is still the nation's leader in timber production. But this productivity came at a price. In its pre-computerized heyday, roughly 1850 to 1950, logging was such a dangerous profession that it inspired its own colorful terminology.
They had barber chair, which is a tree that splits in half as it's being cut and comes back and gets the individuals. And there's also widowmakers, which are the limbs that come out of the tree that can come down and hit somebody.
Today, the industry relies on huge computerized machines called tree harvesters. Now, one person can do the work that an entire crew of a dozen men did years ago.
There are machines that do everything. It takes one man to cut the tree and put it into segments for the mills, and it's all done by computer and a hydraulic machine. And they do that, takes the tree down, and probably processes in less than a minute.
Oregon will never be accused of being a state full of workaholics, as there are just too many other things to do besides making money. Just ask any Oregonian.
You can be snowboarding right first thing in the morning, get down to the river and windsurf for the afternoon, get in your car, drive here to the coast, and you're surfing the sunset.
In Oregon, people believe that you should preserve the greatness, the beauty of its nature for future generations. There is a kind of sense that it's not me, 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 but everyone.
There was a time when every state in the Union celebrated the 8th of January as a major national holiday, second only to the 4th of July. Today, that holiday is recognized in only one state, the state where the Battle of New Orleans took place in 1815. Greetings from Louisiana. On April 30th, 1812, it became the 18th state to join the Union. With 4.3 million residents, Louisiana ranks 25th in population.
We're a festival state. Crawfish, cotton, watermelon, chipmunk, pecan, peach. We got them all, man. We are a celebratory state. We love our celebrations. You ever been there? You ever looked out over those rivers at night and stuff? You golly, man, how can you not fall in love with that?
In Louisiana, it's the river, the river, the river. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't the river. We wouldn't have the history that we have except for the river. It really is the alpha and omega of everything we do, everything we're about, everything we've enjoyed, everything we suffered. It's the central feature of Louisiana history.
About 40% of all the coastal wetland environments in the U.S. are found in Louisiana. But nearly 30 square miles of these low-lying marshy expanses are being lost to coastal erosion every year. Still, it's a lot of water, which means a lot of bridges. Louisiana has more than any other state. The Lake Pontchartrain Causeway, at nearly 24 miles, is the longest water bridge in the world. Louisiana is the only state that calls its subdivisions parishes rather than counties, a vestige of the old Catholic parishes that existed during French and Spanish rule. Louisiana's history of Spanish, French, Native American, and American influences provides it with a rich culture.
Louisiana is much more like a gumbo bowl of cultures. And the essence of a good gumbo is that each ingredient goes in, keeps its flavor, but contributes to the overall taste of the whole dish.
Our most famous neighborhood is called the French Quarter, but architecturally, it's much more Spanish.
The Spanish were the first Europeans to come, but they didn't stay in large numbers. Some 150 years later, in 1682, French explorer Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle claimed the entire Mississippi Basin for France. He named it Louisiana after King Louis XIV and established a permanent settlement in New Orleans. But the state owes much of its heritage to French settlers who came from Canada, not France.
In 1763, Britain won the French and Indian War, and because the British were not sure of the allegiance of the French population in Acadia, which is now known as Nova Scotia, they expelled the Acadians and burned their homes. Some of them came to Louisiana.
Over time, the term Acadian was shortened to Cajun. Today, Cajun culture is a mix of music, language, and especially food.
Being Cajun is probably all about food. Crabs, shrimp, raw oysters, gumbos, jambalaya. We got a lot of pride in our cooking and our food. We really do. Maybe too much.
Good Cajuns, one of the things you're talking about at lunch is where you're going to eat supper at,
The Acadians were well settled in 1803 when France sold the region to the U.S. as part of the Louisiana Purchase.
When Napoleon sold Louisiana, he didn't sell it for 4 cents an acre. He sold it for 4 cents a gallon because it was the Mississippi River he was trying to keep out of British hands. The War of 1812 from the British side was intended to undo the American Revolution. And in order to control the continent, they knew they needed to control the Mississippi River.
They don't believe that New Orleans is very well protected, so they're very confident that it's going to be a fairly easy job for them to go in and seize it. Fortunately for New Orleans, Andrew Jackson also arrives. And Andrew Jackson was a factor that the British hadn't counted upon.
Jackson's ragtag army, which included Choctaw Indians, French pirates, and black freedmen, was just half the size of the British force. But the strategic use of defensive earthworks and artillery gave Jackson the advantage. On January 8, 1815, 2 large columns of British infantry marched straight at the American lines.
They came across a field that was just a killing zone, commanded by a man in Andrew Jackson who was a really hardcore killer.
Men were being slaughtered right and left. General Sir Edward Packingham, the commanding general of the entire British force, was shot dead, probably about 800 yards from the American line. After that, there was nothing left to do but for the British force to retreat. The Americans carried the day.
In that one battle, the British suffered more than 2,000 casualties. The Americans only had 71.
It ends the war with an unprecedented victory. Jackson saves New Orleans, he saves the river, he saves the state, he saves the Western Republic, he saves everything, saves American honor.
The victory propelled Jackson to the presidency in 1829, and his triumph at the Battle of New Orleans was celebrated nationally until the Civil War, when sympathy for this Southern victory changed dramatically. Louisiana seceded from the Union in January of 1861, and by April of 1862, federal troops had captured New Orleans for its strategic position at the mouth of the Mississippi River. This critical position on the Gulf has always been both a blessing and a curse for Louisiana. Floods and hurricanes have long plagued the state, none worse than Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Now considered to be the most devastating and costly natural disaster in U.S. history. But Hurricane Katrina was not without precedent. In the spring of 1927, torrents of rain fell throughout the upper Mississippi Valley and came flooding towards Louisiana. By May of 1927, the lower Mississippi had swelled in some spots from a few hundred yards to over 60 miles. 700,000 people were displaced by the disaster. Nearly half of them were poor, rural African Americans who were sent to relief camps.
The conditions were so bad in some of the black refugee camps, the federal government didn't even want to include that in their reports because it was just too terrible. Everybody's muddy, everybody's wet, everybody's tired, everybody wants somebody to do something for them, and there's Huey Long saying, I have a program, I have a plan, and I know how to pay for it.
Huey P. Long was elected governor in 1928 and changed the history of Louisiana.
Huey Long said everyone was going to be a king. He must have got 99% of the black vote.
He did do a lot of things that to this day are still good, like free school books, built some really fine bridges over the river, but he was known to be pretty crooked.
One of the funny stories about when they put in I-49, I believe it is that it goes like this. And everywhere it stopped was the politician's property.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt thought Long was one of the most dangerous people in the nation. He was dangerous, of course, to Franklin Roosevelt because he was setting himself up, Huey Long was setting himself up to become president in 1936.
He never got the chance. In September of 1935, Huey Long was cut down on the steps of the Louisiana State House by an assassin's bullet. Long's legacy of assistance to the poor people of Louisiana in the years following the flood of '27 was recalled in the aftermath of another waterborne catastrophe, Hurricane Katrina of 2005.
The 27 flooding Katrina have the remarkable similarity that federal help didn't show up on time. It causes enormous suffering and causes an exodus of people in Louisiana. Historians now are calling this the greatest natural disaster in the history of the United States.
It was like no atom bomb. The destruction, it would take 3 to 4 atom bombs to match the destruction of this storm. I've been in New Orleans for 50 years. This is my home. It can't be fixed. It got to get tore down. It can't be fixed.
Without a massive infusion of federal funds, such as was given to Europe after World War II, the rebuilding will be so slow and gradual that Louisiana will be as it was during Reconstruction after the Civil War.
The recovery from Katrina has been slow, and just like the flood of 1927, Katrina's impact will be felt for decades.
If I were governor and had billions of dollars at my disposal, the first thing I'd do is try to clean that up. You have to restore the confidence of the people. And once you restore their confidence, their soul, their spirit will get in there and they will recharge themselves, and it'll be like we've always known it.
Within the borders of this state is a settlement that has been inhabited continuously for 1,000 years, the oldest such community in the nation. Greetings from New Mexico, America's 47th state. It joined the Union on January 6, 1912. With 1.9 million residents, it ranks 36th in population.
When I was little, we lived in this small town, Ruidoso, New Mexico, and it was about 3 hours southwest of Albuquerque. Every year we would drive up for the state fair, the New Mexico State Fair, and I remember that very fondly because I loved the carnival rides. They'd shear sheep. Although they sheared sheep like right next door in Ruidoso, but there was something nice about watching them do it publicly.
New Mexico has more sheep and cattle than people, but it also boasts more PhDs per capita than any other state. This makes it the perfect spot for Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic Space Travel Company, which is building a $200 million spaceport in southern New Mexico. Their plan is to launch a suborbital space liner in a few years. But New Mexico's association with outer space is nothing new. On July 8, 1947, the United States Air Force issued a press release stating that debris from a crashed flying saucer had been recovered near the New Mexico town of Roswell. The news created such a media sensation and global panic that the Air Force retracted the statement asserting that the debris was actually from an experimental weather balloon. Today, Roswell has developed a tourism industry based upon the legendary landing site. Three years following Roswell's UFO incident, the tiny town of Hot Springs craved its own attention and went to some lengths to get it.
Ralph Edwards, who ran the show Truth or Consequences, offered free publicity to any American city which would rename itself. And Hot Springs accepted that challenge, and it renamed itself Truth or Consequences.
Good to his word, Ralph Edwards came to town during the first weekend of May to broadcast the show. Edwards' visit is still celebrated with an annual fiesta that includes a beauty contest, a parade, and lots of New Mexican food.
I get homesick for New Mexican food.
Southwestern cuisine, with its staple ingredient, the New Mexican chili, adds a distinctive flavor to this state.
There are many different types of chili. It starts with the green, and as you can see, it goes from green to orange, and then it dries and you get your red chili. From your red chili, you can make your red chili sauce, which you could put on everything, ranging from enchiladas, tamales, tacos.
The tortillas are fantastic, the burritos. Yeah, the food there is kind of unparalleled.
Equally well regarded are New Mexico's visual artists. In fact, this state is the third largest arts market in the nation, after New York and Los Angeles. Taos and Santa Fe particularly have been well-known art colonies for over a century. Their galleries and museums are legendary.
The light out here in New Mexico just was a huge draw for artists. It was a beautiful place for people to come paint, draw, sketch. The light's unbeatable.
One of America's most prominent artists, painter Georgia O'Keeffe, made the remote village of Abiquiu her home in 1949, capturing images of New Mexico on her canvases. But 20th century artists like O'Keeffe were relative newcomers to New Mexico. The state's artistic roots run deep, grounded in the traditions of ancient civilizations. Dating back centuries, native peoples have exhibited unparalleled skills in pottery, weaving, jewelry making, and other crafts.
Pueblos, Apache, Comanche, Navajo, Ute, and Spanish colonists that came in and over time mixed with so many different people coming into New Mexico and adding to its complexity.
The Pueblo of Acoma has been the home to native peoples since the 10th century. Built high atop a mesa in northern New Mexico, its location was ideal for defense against enemies and is a primary reason why it's the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in the nation. New Mexico's population really began to swell when the Santa Fe Railroad reached the Colorado border in 1872, bringing an influx of settlers and opening up eastern markets to western beef. Competing cattle barons hired professional gunslingers who turned New Mexico into the Wild West. One of the most notorious of these hired guns was Henry William McCarty, AKA Billy the Kid.
He had run away from home at the age of 15 into Arizona, which he got into a knife fight and killed his first man. He fled the law back into New Mexico. This was a kid with what we might call street smarts.
Billy led a fast and furious life, filled with gambling, rustling, and killing. Though his exploits made him infamous, Billy did endear himself to some.
He ends up befriending a lot of the Mexican population who are bringing him into the community. He spoke Spanish fluently.
He had girlfriends up and down southeastern New Mexico. He hid out with them and their families.
On July 14th, 1881, Sheriff Pat Garrett shot and killed Billy the Kid. The book Garrett wrote about this event actually brought Billy national fame that continues today, over 120 years after his death. In contrast to its Wild West past, New Mexico was the site for the Manhattan Project, the building of the atomic bomb during World War II. Robert Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project director, knew of a remote place called the Los Alamos Ranch School, because he had a ranch in the nearby Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The U.S. government used the site to consolidate numerous nuclear research efforts going on around the country.
Within an extraordinary 27 months, from when the project began in April 1943 through to the development of the explosion of the first atomic device, it was this incredible mix of European and American scientists, the most brilliant scientists in the world, who have had to do this extraordinary physics in a very short period of time.
On July 16, 1945, the Trinity test marked the first detonation of a nuclear weapon. The test was called Trinity because 3 bombs were built. The second bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the third on Nagasaki.
For Los Alamos, it began with the Manhattan Project, but it zooms forward to today, where we're doing advanced research in space sciences, in energy. We're working hard to try to do something about the threat of terrorism, especially biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons here in the United States.
If you hear any explosions in Santa Fe, just south of Los Alamos, don't be alarmed. The people of this old town love to celebrate their history. One way they do it is with a giant flaming marionette called Zozobra, or Old Man Gloom. Every fall, a festival commemorates the Spanish quelling of an Indian Pueblo uprising in 1712. Residents build a 50-foot boogeyman puppet and stuff it with divorce papers, bad report cards, and eviction notices, representing all the negative things that the people experience during the year.
Zozobra is made of 4 distinct components. His head is independent from the body, therefore he can move and he can look. There are shoulders, there's a belly, and there's the arms.
He's huge, like 60 feet. There's fire dancers, and then they fireworks everywhere, and everyone yells, "Burn him!" and "Que viva la fiesta!"
Who knew that that was in New Mexico? People don't think of the historical parts of it or all of the amazing recreational things that you can do there. New Mexico rules.
It's true that the American Civil War was fought mainly in the southern states of the Confederacy, and most would guess that the northernmost battle took place at Gettysburg in the state of Pennsylvania. Guess again. Greetings from Vermont, the first state to join the original 13. It entered the fledgling Union on March 14, 1791. With 600,000 residents, it ranks 49th in population.
I was raised up on a mountain, and it was just surrounded by trees on all sides. And it was just amazing. And every season was just spectacular, from winter to spring to summer and then fall. And everyone comes in for fall foliage.
Vermont comes from the French words vert and mont, meaning green mountains. But when these green mountains start turning red, orange, and yellow in the fall, the only green to be found is that of tourist dollars.
We have a tendency to refer to those who come to visit us as flatlanders, the people who come in the autumn to see the best foliage in the world, leaf peepers.
What visitors may not appreciate, however, is that below these mountains lies the real secret of Vermont's success: granite. In fact, Vermont supplies the granite used for every headstone in Arlington National Cemetery. Though its next-door rival, New Hampshire, mines a lot of this same stone, Vermont actually produces more granite than the granite state.
They were named before we were, and they have a lot of granite also, but the mountains are all made of granite, but it's not a good quality of granite. Vermont granite is the best granite in the whole wide world.
Vermont is a land of fascinating firsts. It is said that a Vermonter was the first Revolutionary soldier to shoot a British soldier at the Battle of Lexington on April 19, 1775. The state was also home to the first cast steel plow, the first incarnation of a postage stamp, and the very first patent. U.S. Patent Number 1 was issued to Vermont resident Samuel Hopkins in 1790 for compounds used to make soap and fertilizer. The patent was signed by George Washington himself. If that wasn't enough, in 1777, Vermont ratified the first state constitution to outlaw slavery and also to abolish the requirement that voters must be property owners. Vermont is justly famous for being the #1 state for making maple syrup, and lots of it. The state produces more than 460,000 gallons of the stuff every year, 1/3 of all the maple syrup made in America.
And then in Belmont, Vermont, my dad has a maple syrup brewery where we produce just premium, world-class, tasteful maple syrup.
Vermonters have been making syrup since colonial days. And everything about the state seems steeped in colonial history. Perhaps surprisingly, it also played a crucial role in the Civil War. Nearly 30,000 Vermonters volunteered right away to serve with the Union Army. But on October 19, 1864, while they were away fighting, St. Albans, Vermont became the site of the northernmost battle of the war.
Confederate raiders under a man named Bennett Young from Kentucky come down out of Canada, and on the 19th of October in early afternoon, suddenly they appear on the main streets and enter St. Albans' 3 banks, which were full of money that day because there'd just been a big sale of horses.
Young rounded up all the residents and held them at gunpoint, declaring that St. Albans was now in the possession of the Confederate States of America.
Now, their intent is not only robbery. Also, they want to burn St. Albans to the ground. They have some grenades in their possession. Very fortunately for the Vermonters, it had been raining for several days before the raid, and when they throw their grenades, they fizzle. They make off with 208,000 Yankee dollars and head back for Canada.
But as soon as the Confederates crossed the Canadian border, they were arrested by the Canadian authorities and forced to return the money. Despite Vermont's brush with the Civil War and its fame for its maple syrup, people today are more likely to associate the state with ice cream.
Chunky Monkey,
Cherry Garcia,
chocolate chip cookie dough, dastardly mash.
Ben and I had each saved $4,000 to start out. We went to a local bank. They gave us another $4,000, so we started with $12,000 back in 1978.
Aloha macadamia, butter pecan.
Found an old gas station that we renovated ourselves.
Caramel Sutra.
Ethan almond.
It turns out Ben really can't taste very well, and he wanted a lot of texture contrast and texture variation, so we started putting cookies and candies and a lot of chunks.
Can I help you?
Ben & Jerry's was an immediate artistic success. People loved the ice cream. We had no idea what we were doing in terms of a business, but we had a lot of happy customers.
Well, California has surfing, some great surfways, but Vermont sure does got the good snow. Burton Snowboards was founded in 1977, Stratton, Vermont, near where I grew up. And snowboarding in Vermont just led me to do it and really strive with it and put a lot of passion into it. And thank you, Vermont. Appreciate it.